This was for us in terms of coming up with our BDS position and supporting it after basically 20 years of talking about the situation between Israel and Palestine within our union in resolutions. We have conventions every other year, which we've had for the last 10 years. Previous to that, we had conventions every year. So the BDS resolution was, as Al said, a logical next step for our union on this issue and in relation to our historic support for oppressed workers in the United States and abroad. This is not a new issue for our union. The overall spirit of our resolution, justice and peace for the peoples of Palestine and Israel, has been introduced and debated in one form or another at numerous previous national conventions and General Executive Board meetings for nearly 2 decades. However, the increasing repressive and rightward shift of the Israeli government brought a new sense of urgency to the occupation of Palestine. Massive bombing of Gaza in 2014, the continuing ramping up of Israeli government-sanctioned settlements, the separation wall, increasing restrictions on Palestinian workers working in Israel, increasing repression of Palestinians and Palestinian activists, blockade and destruction of flotillas, increasing apartheid conditions in the occupied territories. It meant that if we were consistent about even-handed treatment, yet nothing about that phrase was being in any way supported or promoted by the U.S. and Israeli governments, it was incumbent and logical that we would then take the next step and support a more proactive strategy, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The debate on the resolution on the convention floor last August was really more of a discussion, as there was virtually no opposition to it, and one delegate who was going to oppose it came up to the mic to voice support, stating that when he first read it, he wasn't sure about it. But the more he read it, he realized it did express his own feelings about the situation. Simply thinking about something or vocalizing one's thoughts, pro or con, is oftentimes not as challenging as reading or putting it in writing, especially on such deeply felt issues such as the occupation of Palestine. We see this all the time on the more controversial issues we debate at our national conventions, be it the war on Iraq, women's reproductive freedom, or climate change. The process of debating and passing resolutions is a very clarifying and democratic way to discover the truth about how a very diverse group of people feel about something. It was passed unanimously at our convention. The week after the August 2015 convention, we issued a press release concerning the convention, and part of the press release, including the text of our resolution on Palestine and Israel and the convention's support for BDS. 2 days later, the Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, ran an article entitled, U.S. Industrial Union Votes to Endorse BDS. A few days later, the Times of Israel published an article, U.S. Industry Union Votes to Boycott Israel, followed by the Jerusalem Post publication of their article with a similar title. Then a New York online website published a more original article critical of our support for BDS entitled, Shocker, United Electrical Workers Union endorses anti-Israel BDS. Shortly thereafter, the National Union received a letter from the director of the Anti-Defamation League condemning our resolution. Then a U.S. attorney named David Abrams and an Israeli-based organization called Sharit Hadin filed an unfair labor practice charge against UE and wrote a letter to General Electric alleging that by adopting the resolution, the union had violated Section 8B4, the secondary boycott provision of the National Labor Relations Act that was part of the 1947 Taft-Hartley, part of the Taft-Hartley Act. Sharit Hadin regularly challenges speech that it deems critical of Israeli policies, often filing baseless lawsuits aimed to harass speakers and discourage others from openly critiquing Israel. Sharit Hadin is probably best known for suing former President Jimmy Carter in an attempt to prevent the publication of a book he authored that it deemed unfairly critical of Israeli policies. Sharit Hadin also made headlines when it recently filed a class action lawsuit against Facebook for being a, quote, accessory to terror, and when it filed a complaint with the IRS against the Presbyterian Church USA because of its alleged terrorist ties. In September 2015, Sharit Hadin sent a letter to General Electric CEO Jeffrey Immelt threatening to sue GE in an attempt to induce GE to commit an unfair labor practice by abrogating its national collective bargaining agreement with UE that we've had with the company for 7 decades. UE General Counsel Joseph Cohen, directly after I conclude my remarks, will make a complete report on these actions from Shirat Hadin and our response to them. Since then, we have also received a letter from a company CEO, who shall remain nameless, denouncing the position UE members unanimously took at our national convention, and making veiled threats about UE members who work at his establishment being on the side of terrorists by supporting the BDS resolution. From the first news articles about our members' support for the BDS movement up until the present time, the receptionist at our national office is deluged with hundreds of emails and phone calls whenever an article appears and the pro-Israeli government forces orchestrate another round of calls and emails against the UE. Like United with Israel's call to action, which for several weeks were calling on its supporters to call and email our national office. As you can imagine, many of these are vicious threats made against our organization and individuals in our organization. Many confuse us with the electricians union and vow to never use another IBEW electrician again. Some, particularly those directed at elected leaders or staff with Jewish-sounding names, threaten violence or other really disgusting actions to discredit them. We have to continually monitor our Facebook pages, especially after another campaign has begun, to remove the vile, unsubstantiated rants of the deranged few who are egged on by these organizations. All of these efforts, like the anti-communist and anti-labor McCarthy red-baiting area of the 40s and 50s, are intended to intimidate and disrupt our union in order to force us to submit to the forces of repression and reaction. However, we have no benefactors, we have no bosses we have to bow down to in the UE. We only answer to our members, who are authorized and passed this resolution in the first place. We expect these tactics by the anti-Palestinian forces to continue, and we are prepared for them. But, like our union's opposition to U.S. military intervention in foreign wars, the key to maintaining these positions is for our members to be exposed and to further gain a fuller understanding of the issues in the occupied territories and Israel's role in building an apartheid state that is massively violating the human rights of Palestinians through its occupation. Just a few weeks ago, I received a letter from the CEO of UE Represented Business that I mentioned earlier. The letter had all the cliches that are hurled at those of us who denounce the destruction of Palestine and the rights of Palestinian people. BDS is anti-Semitic, anti-peace, and anti-worker. By supporting BDS, the U.S. is supporting terrorism. And he talks about the BDS movement being responsible for the loss of SodaStream jobs for Palestinian workers that has since been refuted by the CEO of SodaStream, who states it was the Israeli government's restrictions on work permits that prevented Palestinians from working at SodaStream. The president of that local, from the CEO of the company who sent me the letter, made copies of this letter and distributed it to the membership in that factory, along with copies of the UE resolution. Negotiations for a new collective bargaining agreement in this company are about to begin. And if the company attempts to use our union's support for BDS as a blunt force instrument in these negotiations, we are prepared. The most common comments from members about the company's response has been a sense of astonishment and insult that their union is being accused of supporting terrorism by supporting the BDS movement, and that the accusation is coming from the owner, who has never expressed an ounce of sympathy for the plight of workers in the U.S., Israel, and certainly not Palestine. More importantly, however, has been the ocean of support our union has received from our members taking the stand they did to support BDS. The Electronic Intifada, Jewish Voices for Peace, U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, and many others have come to our aid and defense. Primarily, that solidarity was getting out into the mainstream media and throughout the progressive community, articles and reports supporting our members to support for BDS and condemning the reaction against it. U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation began a petition support campaign that garnered thousands of signatures. In December 2014, a 13,000-member grad student UAW Local 2865 at the University of California passed a resolution endorsing BDS, becoming the first AFL-CIO local union to do so. Additionally, last September, a delegation of trade unions from Connecticut went to Palestine. The result of their trip was a resolution at the subsequent Connecticut AFL-CIO convention calling on the national AFL-CIO to, quote, adopt the strategy of BDS and demand that our government bring an end to the occupation of Palestine and a fair and just peace was passed overwhelmingly at their convention. Despite rejections by these resolutions by the national bodies of these unions, the fact that the resolutions were debated and passed is significant in the continued development of a foreign policy that is independent of the democratic political establishment and the Israeli government lobbying operation in Washington. At UE's Northeast Regional Council meeting last October, one of the participants in that Connecticut trade union delegation and a retired international rep for the UE made a presentation on their trip and what they learned from Palestinian workers and trade unionists. Additionally, Al Hart made a presentation on the origins of the occupation of Palestine and the resulting calamity of Israeli repression of Palestinian rights to the present day. The resulting discussion from that presentation revealed again our members' deep sense of disquiet and torment over our government's continued uncritical support of the Israeli government's creation of apartheid conditions in the occupied territories in violation of Palestinian human rights. There was a member who opposed UE's position, but he was alone amongst 50 others who embraced it. Despite attempts by anti-Palestinian organizations and forces within the trade union movement to put the genie back in the bottle and obstruct this progress, the cat, as they say, is out of the bag. Trade unionists and a younger generation are seeing through the smoke and mirrors thrown up by AIPAC and the pro-Zionist forces. There is every reason to believe that the BDS movement will continue to grow and gain support in likely and some not so likely places. It is the logical next step in the decades-long attempt to bring a semblance of even access and justice to Palestinian people and their homeland against the continued repression and violation of their rights by the Israeli government. It worked to bring down the apartheid system in South Africa, and there is every reason to believe that as it gathers momentum, it will have a similar effect on the apartheid conditions imposed by the Israeli government on the Palestinian people.